I went to Rosary College in River Forest, Illinois. That is now Dominican University. And it was a scholarship. Our family didn't have a lot of money for sending people to college. So luckily, I got a ride to college, but I had to commute from South Shore. We lived in South Shore, near the lake. That was nice. But the trip out to Rosary was for 4 years until I graduated.
And then after you graduated, you stayed on, didn't you?
After I graduated, I went on to get a master's. I knew I was going to be teaching, and I needed a master's to teach in high school. So I went to the University of Chicago and stayed there long enough to get a master's in Spanish. When I was getting my master's in Spanish, Rosary was looking for a Spanish teacher, Dominican University. So I went back to my alma mater and taught there for 6 years. For listening. Do you have any other questions?
The other thing I wanted to mention was that with Scott Forsman, you were the first woman vice president.
There were two of us so close together that I don't remember whether I was first or whether she was first. But there were, yeah, that's right.
That's good. Good for the women.
Well, it was good. It was the right time I was in the right place at the right time. They were actually looking for people to promote because there was pressure on the outside, you know. But yes, it was a very good job, a very interesting, very, very interesting job.
Yeah,
so,
right. So
that's it.
That's it.
So we were in Paris. We were all leaving Paris to go back to the States. And I had to stay in Paris because the Fulbright year was going to begin in October, and this was only the beginning of September. But this was really a joyous discovery because it meant that I could live in Paris for 2 whole months and enjoy everything that Paris has to offer. And everybody that's listening to me knows about that. I did first have to find some place to live. And the idea was for a foreign language teacher, you lived with a family because you wanted to speak the language all the time. And hopefully you were able to eat with the family so you could have intelligent conversation in the foreign language with the family. So I did find a place, and to make it short, I had a wonderful 2 months in Paris, actually. I went to plays that I had read in school, and now I had a chance to see the plays with real French actors. I visited all the museums. I walked along the Seine and the bookstalls, got out to Versailles, and did everything that every tourist wishes they had plenty of time to do when they're in Paris. The beginning of October, there was a bit of it wasn't an interruption, it was a joyous interruption. The Fulbrighters had all gathered in Paris, and we were to have an orientation at the Sorbonne, in French, of course, and that was marvelous. We have wonderful French-speaking, obviously, professors who gave us an introduction of what kind of thing French life would be like in the provinces and all that. It was very, very interesting. It was kind of terrifying. I had realized I had had a wonderful education at Dominican University in French because actually I could speak French better than some of the other Fulbrighters who had gone to fancy universities, but they didn't have the same technique of teaching that the Rosary people did. I ended up at Scott Forsman. It was very interesting at SRA, but my particular love of foreign languages wasn't being represented there, and a job was offered to me at Scott Forsman here in Glenview. So I started at Scott Forsman and was there for 17 years. I'll add that the major things that I was involved in producing with a group of editors and writers and authors from the outside, the whole thing from the beginning of
foreign language.
Foreign language, yeah, French and Spanish, and English is a foreign language. And I can say that job was glamorous. It was a hard job, but it became very glamorous because you visited all the teachers' meetings, and once they met in Paris. French teachers met in Paris, and then they met in Hawaii and Puerto Rico and in many of the cities in this country that have good facilities for conventions. So there was travel, there was a lot of hard work, but there was a sense of working with teachers was just wonderful. Most of the people that were
there, you did something else very interesting.
While I was there, there was a big interruption on the outside. The civil rights movement had gotten really kind of heated up. There was a lot of activity in Selma, Alabama. There was a Voting Rights Act going on, and something that attracted national attention was something that happened when a nonviolent march was started out of Selma. They were going to go to Montgomery to plead for the voting rights in Selma. Of course, the problem was all over the South, but Selma was a particular place at this time. Well, these marchers were starting to march across the bridge, and you will have read about it because I still have clippings that are all over the papers in 1964, and it drew a lot of attention, and particularly in Chicago. There were Chicago religious groups getting together, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. And I really wanted to go. I felt that I could get away from my job for a while, and I had been a little bit involved in civil rights ideas before that when I was in college and so forth. So I decided I'd try to go, but how could I get there? I didn't know how to get to Selma safely, or alone. And so I called the Catholic Interracial Council to see if they were sending a group, and indeed they were. And they said, if you can get over to O'Hare by X amount of time tomorrow, you can come with us. There was a group going. There were priests, and there were nuns, and there were lay people. And it ended up there would be about 200 people in Selma, but that particular group was probably about 40. So I got to the airport. We transferred at Atlanta, transferred again to get to Selma. To get to Montgomery, and from Montgomery we were met by cars that took us to Selma, and by that time there was enough preparation made that we knew we'd have a place to stay and places to eat. And guess what? The natives in the black section were all hosting all of us who were visiting, and we were to have our meals at the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and we were to stay within the black area, not to leave. It was dangerous. A Protestant minister had been killed just within 2 or 3 weeks before that, and they were a little worried about violence. So I was signed into a house that housed 2 priests, 2 ministers, and 3 women, one of whom was the mother of 3 children who had come down there for the same purpose that I did. Anyway, what we did there basically was we would meet during the daytime, and we did have some lessons in order to be able to protect ourselves in case there was any violence. There could be some. And we met in the evening. We agreed to be at the to be on a vigil at a line that separated the black section. On the other side of the line were state troopers that would spend all the night there in their cars and so on. And also there was a podium where black preachers would tell jokes and so on, and would especially preach. And the preaching was extremely moving, including to all the clergy who were there. They looked very, I don't know, surprised, or whatever the good word is. The preaching was all about nonviolence and about love. It was entirely positive and very, very moving. We stood there. There was no violence while we were there. Was still going to be visiting my brother and his little family who were in Germany. So that turned out to be a very good thing for my foreign language, because I enrolled in an interpreters institute, and I learned a lot of German there. It was let me give some German for those of you who understand it. You'll enjoy. Sprachen- und Dolmetscherinstitut. And I was in a class with other Americans who were studying German in order to get into the opera. It was much easier to break into the opera in Germany in that year, 1957, than I think it ever was here in the States. So I got to know German students, got to know some German, and by then,
telling us a little bit about your family?
Yes, I'd like to tell you about my family. Maybe I better tell you when I was born. May I do that? It's a long time ago, 1923. I was the oldest of 7 children, and my mother and father were Chicagoans. They both worked for the city of Chicago. Dad worked as a captain in the police department, and my mother was a teacher in the Chicago schools until she started having her children. And then there were 7 of us. So I went to parochial schools when I was a child, and I got interested in my life's work as a freshman in high school. We had to take Latin, and I realized that I really loved foreign languages. And that became a part of my career, starting with Latin, adding French when I was a sophomore in high school, and then going on in college by adding Spanish and other languages. Sponsored by the University of Barcelona. And it was a lovely time that I remember with joy even now. We met in the morning on the shores of the Mediterranean under a spreading tree, guided by a professor from the University of Barcelona, and the job under the tree was to speak Spanish. We were able to do that with natives because the natives wanted to join us. The natives of Mallorca wanted to be friends with all these Europeans. They were mostly Europeans. I was the only American. But they joined us so we could practice Spanish speaking with them. Various universities, and I was going to the University of Grenoble in the French Alps. Getting to Grenoble, I then again had to find a place to live. And I luckily found a good place, a little bit outside of town. It was a 10-minute bus ride into the university, and I had a gorgeous view of the French Alps. So that was an academic year in France. It was joyous to be studying French with French. Other students were French speaking, were French themselves. And I also joined a choral group there to get to know more French students. Was able to do a little beginning skiing in the French Alps because the students went out for fairly by that time, I had thought over this business of the Congo and thought, maybe I should go. So I decided, I called them and said, yep, I'll go with you. Well, they were already gone. They had to leave in February, but I had said this a little bit before. And so my job was to get a visa and get myself to the Congo. Why was I going? Well, I too had idealistic notions of what I could do with my life. And I really did want to help them. So I was in the Congo for 2.5 years. What did I do there? Well, the fact that I knew French was important because Belgium was a French and Flemish-speaking country, but the major European language in the Congo, and done by all the officials, the Belgian officials that were there, that major was French. So I was able to do the paperwork. There was a lot of paperwork between Africa and Brussels, and I was able to relieve one of the nuns. This was a Catholic mission. One of the nuns who was a nurse who spent her time on paperwork, she was able to go back to nursing, and I could do that. Well, it wasn't full time, but it was one of the things I could help with. I would travel with my brother-in-law to the bush to bring back sick people who were in smaller villages and who needed care at the hospital. And at that time, we also had a setup for weighing babies. If you weigh After the 6 years, I went to France. I had applied for a scholarship and it wasn't awarded immediately, but my family, my brother, my sister, and my aunt and I were going to do a trip to Europe. It was a big trip to Europe. By this time it was 1950, and we went on a boat that had been a carrier of soldiers before. It was the Volendam, and it took us 10 days to cross the Atlantic.
Oh boy.
We had a wonderful trip in Europe, and to get to the end of that, by August we were all ready to go back to our jobs in Chicago. But luckily the scholarship that I had applied to came through at that point.
Well, tell them it was a Fulbright.
Well, it was a Fulbright, and in Chicago for a while. I had intended to go back, and I felt that I was being fairly useful in the Congo. I had taught a nephew to read, and that was really fun. I was using Scott Forsman materials for that, Dick and Jane, and he just loved it. So I was teaching them, and a couple of other things that I probably have forgotten to mention. But anyhow, I didn't go back. Instead, I stayed. I had the 19-year-old brother and a helper who had been with our family for years, and got a job in publishing. Now this was a big switch for me because I had always been a teacher before I went to the Congo. However, the job came up all of a sudden. A friend of mine was working for SRA Publishing Company that's still existing today.
Science Research Associates.
That's right, Science Research Associates. They did reading labs. And do you know that company is still existing?
Good.
And they work now. In 1957, now we're jumping a little bit, I did some graduate work at the University of Wisconsin toward maybe a PhD. I did all the coursework, but I was a little hesitant to bury myself in libraries to do the work required for the PhD. So instead, I took a trip to Europe, and that gets into my